And let's dig deeper into the incoming administration's foreign policy with political analyst Richard Heydarian. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Of course, there will be a lot of pomp, pageantry, entertainment throughout the day, a lot of parties. But of course, the focus of the Filipino people and our kababayans will be the speech, the inauguration speech of the incoming president. What do you expect him to say?
First of all, Rico, this is the beauty of democracy, the peaceful transition of power. This is what you're not going to get in a non-democratic country. If the dictator passes away, you don't know who's going to come next. So this is not just pomp and pageantry. This is the embodiment of the beauty of democracy, which is transfer of power through democratic mandate. Now, speaking of this speech, the last president who gave a speech there for his inauguration was Manuel Rojas, right? And this was a time when we were transitioning from the ashes of the war of World War II towards the reconstruction of the country. I really suggest people to read the speech by President Manuel Rojas. He was asking for the people to backing up. These are difficult times. These are impossibly difficult circumstances. I need you people to unify behind me. We have to be a nation. So the sense
it's deja vu. It will be more
exactly.
Like
so the sense I have is
1946, 2022. Now we have a different challenge.
The challenge is, of course, recovery from the pandemic. The challenge is that we have new threats over the horizon. We have geopolitical tensions in the region. The challenge is, of course, the polarization in our politics over the past 6 or 7 years under President Duterte. So yes, he may have won 56, 58, 60% of the votes. But as you mentioned a while ago, there are 40% who had second thoughts perhaps about him. Or many people perhaps who voted for him who just wanted any kind of change, and it happened that he was the most outside-the-box candidate under circumstances. So Bongbong Marcos knows that, and I expect him to come out and say, we need unity, which is very much at the center of his campaign. Now, it was much for vacuous motherhood statements back then, but he's no longer the candidate. He now has the mandate. He's confident. You can see that. His cabinet is coming together. He even appointed himself as the incoming Department of Agriculture cabinet. But the prices of energy is very high. The prices of goods is very high. People are feeling the pinch in the pocket, right? So I think he's going to go out in there. We cannot afford polarization. We cannot afford fights. We have to come together. We have to deal with this economic crisis. And then, of course, Rico, the important thing is also to look at the people, the dignitaries who are going to come from every key partners. They're there, not only from China, but also from Australia, from United States, different partners that we have.
So what is that trying to say? We have the second gentleman here. We have the vice president from China, key officials from
Governor
overseas.
General of Australia.
Yeah, but what are they trying to tell this new administration? That we are behind you 100%?
Right. I think Marcos domestically is saying, I'm a unifying president, and internationally saying is that as a unifying president, as the first majority president since my father, you have to deal with me accordingly. And at the same time, I want to deal with all of you in ways that will enhance my national interest, our country's national interest. Not only because I like one country over the other, because this has been the problem, Rico, over the past decades, right? We had presidents. Some of them have more preference for one superpower over the other. But in the case of Marcos, I think he's signaling that he wants to work with the word he used was a network of partners and allies. That's what he wants to work with.
So, Richard, I'm just quite curious. Why haven't we had a majority president up until now post-EDSA?
Precisely because we have this bizarre system of single round first past the post. As you know, in many democracies, there is a run-off elections. And in the case of US, of course, you have essentially a two-party system with barely a third party always there. So it's much...
we have multi-party systems that keep on changing.
And one round only. So we had presidents who won barely above 24% of the votes. That's Fidel Ramos. And actually, interestingly, Rico, back in 1992, had Imelda Marcos and Dan Nicuanco teamed up, they would have gotten more than 28% of the votes. They could have recaptured the Malacanang as early as 1992. But now you have here Marcos with 58%. He has 31 million, almost twice the number of former President Duterte, more than twice the number of his closest rival, Leni Robredo. That's definitely something that's going to give you a lot of confidence coming into this presidency.
Do you think that in his inauguration speech, he'll already come up with solutions? This is what we're going to do with the economy. This is what we're going to do with agriculture. This is how we're going to handle the pandemic.
Right. I think we're going to have a preview of essentially State of the Nation address here, right? I think we may hear some numbers here. I think we may hear about strategy. Remember, this is a guy who attended at least Oxford and Wharton. He has some basic familiarity with the macroeconomic language. He is very comfortable with technocrats. I've interviewed some of his incoming cabinet members, NEDA Secretary Balisacan, for instance. If you talk to the technocrats who are going to join him in his cabinet, a lot of them will say, they're pretty impressed with Marcos.
Absolutely, especially with the international community. I mean, Balisacan, you have Pascual, you have Jokno.
Right.
I mean, people who are really experienced technocrats who will be the face to the international investment community.
And they are also impressed with Marcos. The amount of familiarity shows even with the nitty-gritties of agricultural policy, development policy. I mean, we have watched incoming President Marcos' press conference. As you can see, he's confident. He owns the moment, right? And he can talk about issues in an extensive way, which, I mean, with all due respect, it's quite a breath of fresh air after 6 years of President Duterte. Because let's be honest about it, President Duterte really didn't come to the presidency, let's say, in his best years, right? He was the oldest elected president. He was very much obsessed with the drug war issue over and over again over the past 6 years. Marcos is coming in with a different message.
Right.
Technocratic message, development-centered message, internationally balanced foreign policy message, and unity message.
Because the outgoing president wasn't even involved in economic policy. He just left it to the Finance Secretary Dominguez to handle most of the financial issues.
Right, Enrico, I mean, I remember the first time I saw President Duterte was when he was about to give speech at the Makati Business Club. This is March 2016, when he was still a candidate. And, you know, he talked about all sorts of things. I'm not sure the rest I can say here on TV, right? Anything but macroeconomic policy, right? Let's just put it that way.
Monetary policy.
And then towards the end, he said, don't worry about it. I have Jokno and all of these economists will take care of it. Essentially delegation of tasks. Marcos Jr. will be very different because he can speak the language. I mean, he did PPE, he did Wharton. I mean, maybe he didn't graduate, but the point is he knows the basics of macroeconomics. He can speak the language. So you may see even some technocratic terminologies coming out in his speeches, in his SONA, etc., where he talk about his fiscal policy, infrastructure development. He'll talk about let's say, trade or industrial policy, for instance, how to protect the agricultural industry, right? Or energy policy, for instance.
But why hasn't he filled up some key positions right now in his cabinet? The economic team is there, social services, BIR. What about health and energy? What's keeping him from making these key appointments before his inauguration?
Yeah, that's the part whereby I think some people are raising their eyebrows. Like, I mean, it's interesting that we saw... I mean, clearly he wanted to reassure the markets, right? So immediately the technocratic team came together. Now, we knew that there was some issue with his first choice for the finance, right? But eventually Benjamin Jokno, who's very comfortable dealing with controversial presidents, right? He dealt with Arab, with Duterte. So he has no problem dealing with it. So he put that together. But after that, suddenly we saw again some slowing down, right? In terms of appointment. But the DND came in. So if you look at the National Security Advisor, DND, some of the key positions have been filled up. But the Department of Health and Foreign Affairs, these are two of the interesting ones whereby, as far as I know, we have no appointments yet, right? Which is surprising because Department of Health is very much central to our management of the pandemic, right? It's also the department that has been really bogged down by controversies, Farmali, field health issues, etc. I don't know, Rico, maybe he wants certain people, but they're having second thoughts because it's a thankless job. It's a very difficult job. There's going to be a lot of pressure, a lot of cleaning up. So maybe they're trying to bring in the best team possible to really overhaul our response and get our healthcare system together. It has been battered badly. On foreign affairs, I'm hearing a lot of different names. No, some said even Harry Roque could be in the mix after 1 year, right? Some are saying maybe a career officer will take over, one of the undersecretaries who has been present in the meetings with envoys. Others are saying maybe Teddy Boy Locsin still has the chance to stick
But on the flip side, a lot of groups also are involved in this, the so-called unit team, lobbying for key cabinet positions as well.
Definitely. I mean, if you look at it, it's a mixed bag, no, Rico? I mean, on one hand, you have a much more technocratic professional team. You also have progressive, Susan Ople. Balisacan is not only technocratic, he's also a very progressive person there. And then you have people who I think Marcos is very comfortable with, respects a lot, who know a lot about the Marcos legacy. I think National Security Advisor Carlos, for instance, she's been there since ever. since Marcos era, she has been involved with the security and
also a
foreign
lot
affairs
of talk that she would be the DFA secretary.
Right, but National
She
Security
became National
Advisor,
Security.
right, which is still a very important position. And then DND went to a former general, so there's a consistency with Secretary Lorenzana situation. DAR is taking it over himself. Sorry, Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
Let's see what with the DAR, etc. But yeah. But at the same time, also have some people have been loyal to him and his brand of politics. So we have the press secretary position, for instance, a blogger and lawyer, etc. So it's really a mixed bag. I think his cabinet tells you, it's essentially a microcosm of his unity formula, right? Which is going to be a mix of everything, right? Technocratic, progressive. I mean, the term that Amy Marcos uses is team of rivals, kind of Lincolnian. I don't think it's there yet. I think let's not get ahead of herself.
Correct.
But clearly,
I don't
Rico,
see it yet in the
there
cabinet.
is the aspiration.
Okay.
And aspiration is something we can work with. I think one thing I like about the incoming administration is that they want recognition international. They have an aspiration to reach a certain level. I think Marcos Jr. himself said, hindi ako maging perfect, but we'll strive to perfection,
Correct.
which is quite something, right?
And of course, our problem right now is really the economy, turning it around, agriculture.
Yes.
Richard, most of the stuff we eat right now, that's on the food on our table, is mostly imported.
Yep.
And we used to be the number one exporter of rice in the 1960s. Now we're importing rice, we're importing fish, we're importing sugar. So with this in mind, the economy and agriculture, what do you think will be his first executive order when he's in Malacanang?
Right.
What should it be? Should it be about the economy?
First of all, Rico, there's one advantage that Marcos has, which many of his predecessors didn't have. He's the first pro-incumbent president, right? Usually, the presidents are from the opposition. Now, what is the advantage of that? The advantage is he has a say in the budget next year in ways none of the previous presidents had. Because the budget for next year, the fiscal year 2023, was mostly conceptualized by outgoing President Duterte. But because Marcos comes from the same coalition and is an administration bet, his economic team, including incoming budget secretary, they have had a lot of say in what will go there in terms of prioritization. And if you look at it, clearly food security is there, right? Clearly energy security is there. So I think some executive order on how to manage the energy costs will be there. So far, he has been wishy-washy on whether removal of excise tax is something that he wants to do, but something around those lines. Also another thing on rice, right?
Yeah.
Because this was very central to his campaign. He said, 20 na lang pesos yung bigas. Medyo malabo yan kasi meron tayong 80 pesos yung black rice. Kapag titignan ko sa market, nasaan na yung 20 pesos, di ba?
Even the outgoing DAR secretary is saying that it's impossible.
It's impossible.
For 20 pesos
but
per
maybe
kilo.
can bring it down to 35 or 30. So remember, there's also the NFA rice situation, right? So maybe an executive order along the lines of subsidized rice for certain sectors. I think that's something we can look at because I think that's really the most urgent one we can look at. So rice and energy, I think, will be really very much at the center of first executive orders that could come out from this president. Yeah.
What about the past of the Marcos? Will it haunt them in the next 6 years? I mean, it also took time for him to anoint a BIR chief in Lilia Guillermo, who was with the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. When I interviewed her about a week ago, she said, once I see all those documents, I will start talking to him about how much he owes the Filipino people. 23 billion pesos, but if you add all the other interests, it comes to 203. How do you think will this be handled over the next 6 years?
Definitely, Rico, I think the Marcoses would want to extend their honeymoon as much as possible, right? The first 6 months of, the 6 months of 1 year, that's going to be their honeymoon. But I think they want to extend it. Now, one thing that could burst an honeymoon, right?
Yeah.
And trigger opposition and a lot of protests is if they make a move, let's say, on PCGG, which will be interpreted in ways that this is not in consonance with good governance. Or they'll be moved on other controversial issues, including textbooks, for instance, historical textbooks.
Yes.
Well, Sara Duterte will take over the Department of Education. Let's see what's going to happen on that. So the point is now I think everyone is in a wait-and-see mode, especially critics of the administration. But they're waiting for those buttons to be pressed. I think once those buttons going to be pressed, then we're going to see how difficult the situation is going to be. Because you may have 31 million voted for you, but if there are 15 million intensely against you and they're mobilized, that's still going to make things very difficult for you. So I think Marcos would want as much as possible to extend this honeymoon, but he wants to give enough good vibes, let's just put it that way, outside, so that if ever once he moves to the more controversial part, the backlash will be managed. I think this is really going to be the calibration and the navigation that Marcos will have to do in the next 6 months to 1 year to make sure he has the maximum policy space to get the big reforms in his earlier in office.
Everyone is hoping for the best for this incoming administration of Bongbong Marcos. Richard Heydarian, thank you so much for your insights.
Salamat.
Great to have you with us for this CNN Philippines special presentation.